Hey, good evening and welcome back to my channel. Tonight I'm going to do a presentation of another complete set that I put together over the years. This one's going to date back to 17 years ago when I put together this set. As I mentioned previously, I went through a few series of being in and out of collecting baseball cards. And when I came back in the early 2000s, it would have been about 2002, 2003, I was wanting to move towards building sets, and I wanted to try to target certain sets to be able to start completing them. And I was looking at actually starting to do vintage sets at that time, and obviously on probably a limited budget because I was a student in graduate school at that point. So I was having to sell some cards to be able to get money to purchase cards. So that was something that resulted in me selling a lot of the cards from my childhood. So I don't have a lot of those cards left in my collection. When I do have an opportunity to show some of those, I'll kind of point out it's something I had from my early childhood. So like many of us, I've kind of been in and out throughout the years, and I've kind of gone through phases of building sets or collecting certain players and things like that. But this was starting me on the run of actually building vintage set collections. And it started with, but before I begin, I just wanted to kind of point out a project that I'm currently working on. I got an update to this, and this was got a 2001 gold Edgar Martinez, which actually brings my total of Hall of Famers and baseball stars for that set down to about 13, if you account for Series 1 and 2. If I did the traded set, it would be a little bit higher, and obviously that would include the Albert Pujols rookie card, as well as Series 2 would include the Ichiro rookie card. So even though I'm getting close, there's still two big cards that are hanging out there. So I wanted to kind of show you just a mail update on that one. So the set I'm going to actually show you tonight is, again, dates back to 2005 when I was putting this together. It was the very first vintage set that I put together, even though I had put together some more modern sets at that point. But this is when I first was diving into the vintage collection. Even though the binder says 1998 score, I was just repurposing this binder. I believe I got this binder by, if I'm not mistaken, I was able to get this back in 1988 just by sending in proof of purchase from baseball cards from the packages that I had to send in. And then they sent me this binder with some sheets in it. And actually, it's actually really held up over the years. It's actually one of the better binders I have, and it's perfect for this set that I'm going to show you. So the reason I picked this set out is, number one, it was the first set that I put together back in 2005. And there's also a couple cards in there that really kind of draw me towards it. But the reason I picked it out is because currently Topps Heritage is actually featuring the 1973 Topps design. So I thought I would start with that set and kind of go through that. So I wanted to present my 1973 Topps set for people to be able to get a chance to look at. I had a lot of fun putting this together for the very first time. It was the first vintage set that I ever completed. And I started learning a lot more about vintage cards at that time. One of the first things I learned was about cards being released in series and having certain scarcity of certain cards just based on the time of year the cards were released. Many people know that 73 was the last year that cards were released in series until they brought that back in the 90s as a result of just demand, supply and demand. So they would release cards starting in spring through late summer, early fall, just based on what the demand was, would kind of then result in how many cards were printed. 73 was the last set that Topps produced where they did this up until, again, back to the 2000s or through the 90s when they started introducing series again. But the production was pretty similar from one series to the next at that point. So this was very different. This was kind of the end of the vintage era. A lot of people tend to kind of think of it that way. I think now people will kind of include anything earlier than 1980 and earlier would be kind of considered to be the vintage era. So when Topps kind of ruled supreme for many years, people would kind of consider that the vintage era. But when I was a kid, it was kind of 73 and on because a lot of it had to do with not all cards being released at once. So 73 was a stark decrease in the number of cards that were released from 1972. 72 was 787 cards, which was the largest set they had produced at that point, which was released over several series. This one was just 5 series, and it was just 660 cards. There wasn't really any special inserts that came with it other than like team checklists, which I actually don't have in the set. The update series came later in 1974 and 76. So this was just 5 series of cards that featured a lot of Hall of Famers. So that was one of the reasons I was kind of interested in it, because it was released in series. But also there were some pretty iconic cards I felt that were in there that I had owned at that point that really kind of drew me to it. So back in like 2005, I mean, the home run chase was still like a really big thing, because Barry Bonds was getting really close to breaking the all-time home run record. And I think, like many fans, I was still a little disillusioned that Barry Bonds was doing things on the up and up. Now, granted, I know he's never admitted to it, and this could be another discussion another day. But I was very excited about the possibility of somebody passing Hank Aaron. And that kind of made me think of the card right at the top of the set, number 1. This was produced at a time when the home run chase was getting really, really close between Babe Ruth, who obviously had been long gone at that point, his record of 714, but 2 active players of Hank Aaron and Willie Mays. Now, granted, Willie Mays was starting to tail off at this point in 1973, but Hank Aaron still had a few more good years left, and obviously later passed Babe Ruth and held the record, obviously, until Barry Bonds passed it. But the cards that really kind of stood out to me, I'll point them out as I do it, is this first one here. I thought it was really cool. And I love this vintage set because it also is the last cards of 2 really big names in the hobby. And it may have been the first times I got a card from either one of these players. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'll point out some of the key players and Hall of Famers in here as we do that. So again, the first card would obviously be the one with the 3 Hall of Famers on it. I think Heritage this year is doing the current home run leaders as opposed to the all-time home run leaders. So you can kind of see the back of the cards. You can kind of see here it's just a little bit of like a black with a little bit of kind of like a brownish orange kind of centering in there, a design with a cartoon at the top and then stats that are listed below. It's done vertically as opposed to horizontally, so there's not as many stats as they would normally put on the card, as opposed to they actually then gave a little narrative on each and every player on the back of the cards. Centering is notoriously bad in some of these sets in the early 1970s. The action photos, they did a little less of these in this set, although you will see them, like you see in the Chris Chambliss at the top. They're a little bit clearer and a little bit more precise than some of the action shots that you see in like 71 or in 74, which I think is like kind of more notorious of like having action shots where you can't really tell which player is being featured in the card. Don Sutton is another Hall of Famer that's right at the top there, who passed away recently. Randy Hundley is a kind of a local Cubs legend, part of the 69 Cubs. I read today is actually going to be giving autographs at the Chicago Sports Spectacular that's coming up in June that I'll be attending. The first series got not as many packed Hall of Famers as some of the sets from the earlier years, as they kind of spread out a lot of the star players at that point. The first one that kind of stands out is Roberto Clemente. So I had gotten this card probably in the early 2000s, and it was my first Roberto Clemente. This was a card released after his death, so his has a complete stat line on there, but it wasn't an active player at this point. And I think Heritage actually, this year, is actually including that card as part of their set, kind of paying homage to the legacy of Roberto Clemente, but also to what this card meant in this particular set for baseball collectors at that time, but also baseball fans. The league leader cards are featured in this set as they were through most of the 60s and 70s. They have just one player, I believe, on each and every card from each league, unless there's someone that tied for it, but I'm not sure if that showed up in this one. This is kind of fun because this was the year that Dick Allen in 1972 was close to getting the Triple Crown when he played for the Chicago White Sox. So it's pretty neat. I like the league leader cards because you can see a couple different Hall of Famers on the same card. And you can usually get those at a pretty affordable price. Here's more in here. Lou Brock, stolen base leader. Steve Carlton. Carlton and Gaylord Perry on the same card. Nolan Ryan and Steve Carlton. This still would have been the era of doing airbrushing. So at the Milwaukee Brewer hat at the top here was probably playing with another team at that point, but they airbrushed the M on the logo there for it. And you see a lot of that throughout the set where you see a lot of the airbrushing of the logos and uniforms, which is pretty funny. Tony Oliva down here at the bottom. Ernie Banks actually appears on a coach, the manager card, because they have the coaches listed with him too. He had recently retired at that point. Raleigh Fingers up in the corner. Ted Simmons, recently inducted into the Hall of Fame. Brooks Robinson down in the corner. I believe I had that one as a kid too, and it just fell into the set as I started to build it. Hank Aaron here at the top. Maybe not the best image of Hank that they have on any of his cards, but Hank Aaron nevertheless. This was about the time too where like the hundreds always had like a star player on it, so like 100, 200, 300, 400. I believe they started picking that back up with some of the recent products that were released in recent years. But you could always count on like a card at the 100 level or 200 level was going to feature a star in the 70s. Ron Santo down in the corner. If you had just one more year in a Cub uniform. Pete Rose. Hopefully at one point they actually put him in the Hall of Fame. It seems like he's really kind of paying a high price, kind of being excluded from the Hall of Fame this long, along with maybe some other names you can list, but would like to be able to see him in there personally. I know people may have a difference of opinion on that one, and that's just fine. I'm not going to disagree with them either. I can see that point as well. Earl Weaver, Hall of Fame manager up in the corner. Thurman Munson down at the bottom. At some point he might be able to get in. A lot of Munson's cards feature him catching, so you don't get a chance to see his face much on too many cards. It was released during the 70s. We're speaking about Barry Bonds earlier. Here's his dad, Bobby, up in the corner. Jim Palmer. Luis Aparicio. Looks like he's in the wrong uniform to me. Whenever I see him either in an Orioles or a Red Sox uniform, I'm always like, that doesn't look right. He should be in a White Sox uniform. Harmon Killebrew down at the bottom, shortly before he was traded to Kansas City, where he ended his career. Here's one of the Hall of Fame rookie cards in the set. There's two at this point, unless somebody else gets in, like Dwight Evans possibly could get in at some point. Rich Goose Gossage would be the first one that's listed up there. Frank Robinson, when he was briefly with the Angels after he played with the Dodgers. It's another example, if you look at the card closely, of the airbrushing because they took off the Dodgers. They didn't have a picture of him with the Angels. But it's listed as Angels on there. Dick Williams, Hall of Fame manager. Ferguson Jenkins, Hall of Fame pitcher. Jerry Koosman, who was a great pitcher in his own right, but is probably in the hobby more remembered as being the other guy on the Nolan Ryan rookie card. Bob Gibson, made my dad's favorite pitcher growing up. Carlton Fisk, first card where he's pictured by himself. Burt Bryleven and Billy Williams, two back-to-back Hall of Famers there. And then they have the World Series cards, so you can kind of follow the World Series on here. You kind of look through it. I believe this was 73 was, I think, the first year that I think the Athletics won. It may have been the second one that they won, but they won 3 in a row. Not sure if there's like a Reggie Jackson featured card in this one. I believe there isn't at this point. One of the other ones has it, though. Dusty Baker. Should be a Hall of Fame manager, in my opinion. Nolan Ryan. With the Angels, his second year as an Angel. Joe Morgan. My memory more of Joe Morgan, he did play a little bit when I was a kid, but it was kind of after He retired probably by the time I started really remembering baseball games and players, but I remember him mostly because of doing Sunday Night Baseball. Jim Catfish Hunter with the mustache. Eddie Matthews as a manager, even though he's a Hall of Fame ball player. Carl Yastrzemski. Reggie Jackson. Maybe not the best image that they have available of him. It's kind of really hard to see his face because of the sun kind of creating a shadow off the bill of his cap, kind of covers his whole face. And just the resolution of the camera lens didn't really pick up the action shots as well as they had hoped, and it just looks very blurry. You'll see a lot of pictures and images like that. But there's Reggie. Yogi Berra, the manager of the 73 New York Mets, which actually was a pretty famous team because they really crawled their way into the playoffs and eventually went on to win to the World Series. Lost, but also was the last World Series appearance for Willie Mays. Ed Farmer, probably known more locally as one of the radio voices of the Chicago White Sox, who had passed away not too long ago. Tony Perez. Al Kaline. And that was the first Al Kaline I ever got when I was putting this set together. Sparky Anderson. Steve Carlton was a card I had from my childhood too that I kind of just folded into the set as I was putting it together. It was the year he won like 27 games or something like that. Had kind of some crazy ERA, and the team was terribly bad. He won 27-10 and an ERA of like 1.98. My dad talks a lot about this trade because it kind of broke his heart when he saw that the Cardinals just gave him up for Rick Weiss, who was a good pitcher in his own right, but obviously did not end up being a Hall of Fame player. Willie Mays, down in the corner. This was the other card I picked up where I decided I wanted to be able to then start putting the set together. I think it's a cool image of him, even though he looks beyond his years at this point. Probably somebody that's pretty close to kind of hanging it up. It was quite a big ordeal when he actually joined the New York Mets, returning to New York after all those years out in San Francisco. But he was just beyond his prime at that point. Even though he did play a role with the team that went on to be in the World Series, he got hurt, I think, in game 1 or 2, so he didn't have a chance to play the last few games of the World Series. There is a card in 1974 Top Sets that features him actually with the team during that World Series run. But this is the last player card that he had. Dick Allen, someone who was close to making the Hall of Fame during the Veterans vote recently. Hope he gets in there at some point, just as a fan of the game, but also because he was a big White Sox player. One of the 4 guys that actually has won the MVP award as a White Sox. Lou Brock. Billy Martin, not a Hall of Famer, but quite a character. Rod Carew. This one's like terribly off center. Again, I mentioned like centering for this set's not great. Then they have these boyhood photos of the stars, which are hilarious. So Jim Palmer's on there. I think the Joe Torre is really a funny one. I think that comes up later. Jim Hunter is in here, and also Gaylord Perry. Tom Seaver. Willie Pop Stargell. Now here's a card too. It's like you can see he's playing first base, but you also see the guy coming up the line. You're like, okay, who's featured in this card? It's maybe not the best image in the world, but it's just kind of the limitations of the photography at the time. Johnny Bench. Now this one actually is kind of cool. Just kind of seeing him field a ball near the dugout over his shoulder. Gaylord Perry, Willie McCovey, Hall of Fame, Joe Torre, Hall of Fame manager, Bill Freeman died recently, catcher for the Tigers throughout the 60s and 70s. Then there was another sub-series within it where they had the all-time greats in certain categories, and I believe Heritage did update these with the current leaders. But you have some of like the greats of the game. So these are like times where I've got a card of guys I've never probably had before. And granted, it's not when they actually are active players aside from Hank Aaron, but it's still kind of cool getting those nevertheless. So you can see Cobb, Garrick, Aaron, Cobb again, Walter Johnson, Cy Young. Juan Marichal. Here's one where the action image I think actually kind of works. See him falling off the mound, which he was pretty famous for in his windup. Probably often imitated by kids during that era. Red Shandies, Hall of Fame player. Phil Niekro. Gates Brown, who has the unfortunate nickname, but I think because he actually like spent some time in prison, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want to be incorrect in saying that, so please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I think that's how he got his nickname, which is kind of unfortunate. Jim Kaat, recently inducted in the Hall of Fame. Artie Herzog, Hall of Fame manager. Orlando Cepeda. Walt Alston, Hall of Fame manager for the Los Angeles Dodgers. A young Jack McKeon cracks me up. I always remember him smoking the cigar when after the Florida Marlins won the World Series in 2003 because he was the manager then. It's so funny seeing him so young in that picture. Then it gets into the rookie cards, which were done by position and not by team, which was a little different than they did them before, and they're all grouped together. This is actually where we're going to find the most valuable card. We're actually into the 5th series now when these appear, which is just kind of convenient that these cards, the big rookies, kind of fall in here. And there's just probably a couple to point out as we get through them. There's some names that played through the 70s and 80s that were kind of note, like a Charlie Hough or Gary Matthews. But like the big names that probably stand out from this era are going to be found on this page here, where we have a Dwight Evans rookie card. I know he kind of comes up on the veterans vote from time to time, but the big one is going to be the Mike Schmidt card. Also has Ron Cey on there, even though that's not his rookie. He was actually in 72 set as well on a rookie card. But the Mike Schmidt one is the most valuable card in the 73 set. It's also a high number, so it's going to cost you a little bit more to get it than it might be for other rookies of the era. And obviously, because of his popularity, just probably being the most popular third baseman, probably in the last like 30, 40 years. You can pick and choose whether you pick him or maybe George Brett, but he was the guy that got 500 home runs, so he kind of stands out in his own way because of those numbers. There's his rookie card without his famous mustache, which always kind of cracks me up, seeing that in his 1974 Topps card before he actually has the mustache by 75. And that's going to be about it for a lot of the big names. Leo Durocher, this is the last time he appears on any baseball card as an active player or manager. He died a few years after this in 1973, I think was his last card as a manager. I don't believe he actually shows up on a 1974 Topps card. I could be wrong if I show that one. It's been a while since I looked at that set. And that is going to be about it. So I would like to thank you all for getting a chance to look at it. I hope people might be interested in getting an opportunity to build a 1973 set in the future. I do see a lot of groups that I'm on through Facebook for set builders and collectors starting to build a lot more stuff from the 70s. Seems to be a lot more popular lately. I really enjoyed building all the 70s sets back in the early 2000s, and I hope anybody watching this video is as equally as excited to be able to start that project or has finished that project or is currently working on it. Have a great night.